There are two questions that are hard for any Animal Collective fan to answer. What is your favorite Animal Collective album, and where do I get started with the band? The problem with Animal Collective is that each album is so incredibly unique from each other that truly no two albums sound alike. There might be some borrowed elements from albums, but even then, the similarities kind of just end at the fact that they are using the same instruments. But I think two reasons that play into this is the fact that the band has a rotating lineup. It's less of a band and more of a collective. There's 4 members in this collective. Not all members have to be present for an album to be made. This is a very interesting way of collaboration that can spawn brand new ideas and thus keeping their music unique throughout their entire career. And I think the main reason why Animal Collective has stayed unique is the fact that they're just really, really weird. They just like to have fun, and they make that very apparent in their music. They don't really like to keep things safe. They just kind of play around and see what sticks. You know, it's like cooking pasta. Hopefully your pasta is going to stick to the wall. If it does, that means it's ready to be released, you know? Their sound never gets old because they don't have a defined sound. They're just weird. My first experience with the band personally was the album Sung Tongs. Winter's Love came up onto my Spotify Discover Weekly, and I said, hey, that's a cool album cover. I'm gonna play the song from the album instead of Discover Weekly for some reason. And so I listened to Winter's Love, and then immediately after it, Kids on Holiday came on. And what blew my mind was how vastly different these two songs were while still keeping the same kind of musical tone, if that makes sense. It does if you heard the album. And then Sweet Road came on right after, and it was the same exact way. I was like, this is so different, but so cool, and yet so familiar. And so I just dove into the album, and I fell in love immediately. This album was made by 2 of the band's members. It was made by Panda Bear and Avey Tare, and it's kind of classified as like freak folk music. If you don't know what freak folk music is, then you're in for a treat. It's very weird. Yeah. The album's instrumentation basically just lies with acoustic guitars, and then there's some samples thrown in there as well. But most of the album's uniqueness comes from the vocals of Panda Bear and Avey Tare, and just the way that they deliver their vocals. It can be super outlandish at times and really off-putting at times, like how they start off the album with Leaf House. There's that like middle portion where they're just kind of going like ooh 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 ah ah ooh 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 ah ah. So don't be afraid if you have to listen to this album a few times before you fully understand it and get it to click, which sounds very pretentious. That's just the vibe of Animal Collective. So honestly, this album might be a good start for you if you like more acoustic music and you're looking for something a little bit more weird and off-putting. And if you like this album, then you'll definitely like their 2003 album, Campfire Songs. This was an album made by Panda Bear, Avey Tare, and Deakin, and it feels a lot more ambient-like than Sung Tongs. A lot more safer as well. It's not as freakish. The album title is very fitting to the vibe of the music. They recorded this album all in one take outside on a porch. You got these really cool like nature sounds going on around you as you're listening to this album, and each song transitions so perfectly into the next because they recorded it all in one take. If freak folk doesn't really get your attention and it doesn't sound like your vibe, I don't blame you. It's kind of a scary sounding genre. Then definitely check out their album Merriweather Post Pavilion. This is their most popular album, definitely their best selling album. This album had Animal Collective messing around with more electronic experimentation. Pretty much every song features super bright synths, and it's probably their most accessible album and definitely their easiest album to listen to, which is why a lot of people would say that this is probably the best starting point for the band. There's also incredible vocal work from Panda Bear and Avey Tare, and honestly some of the best melodies are featured on this album. This album to me sounds like the soundtrack to a perfect summer day, and this album also has some of my favorite Animal Collective songs in it, like Taste and Guy's Eyes and what's that one called? Summertime Clothes. And if you enjoyed the electronic experimentation and electronic instrumentation of Merriweather Post Pavilion, then you'll probably like Painting With. Kind of. I personally haven't seen a lot of love for this album, which is kind of unfortunate, but also kind of makes sense. I feel like the pacing on this album is very strange. Sometimes just the track listing ruins the album, but that doesn't get rid of the fact that it's still really good. There's a bunch of like droney, kind of abrasive synths in this album, and also the vocal work from Panda Bear and Avey Tare on this album is incredible. And the melodies at times can be very dizzying. Avey Tare and Panda Bear are just going like back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. But then in songs like Golden Gals, it's just super catchy. Songs like Florida, Golden Gals, and On Delay just put a smile on my face immediately once I hear it, and I can't help myself from just singing along to it because it's so incredible to listen to and so freaking catchy. Especially Florida, when the chorus comes on, I can't stay still, dude. And then another more electronic experimental album in the band's discography is Centipede Hurts. The concept of this album is that you're flipping through an alien radio station in space. And so if that intrigues you, then check out the album. This is definitely the more experimental album in terms of their like electronic vibe discography, I guess. And honestly, I think it's best enjoyed if you listen to some of their earlier work before you check out Centipede Hurts. It can get really weird at times. I think the abrasiveness in Avey Tare's vocals can be a little off-putting at times because he can just do these weird jumps in his vocals that you aren't expecting, and it always keeps you on your toes. An album that might help you transition from Merriweather Post Pavilion to Centipede Hurts, or to maybe like to Sung Tongs to Merriweather Post Pavilion, is Strawberry Jam. I think this is a very transitional album for listeners because it's probably Animal Collective's most all over the place album. You got a lot of songs that experiment with like electronic instrumentation like Peacebone and Number One, but then you also have songs that are more kind of in that freak folk vibe like Chores and Unsolved Mysteries. But then you also got songs with really cool guitar playing and really interesting guitar manipulation, songs like For Reverend Green and Fireworks. Much like Centipede Hurts, this album does a fantastic job at showing off Avey Tare's vocals because once again, he's really just making these weird freaking vocal jumps that you're really not expecting. And this honestly might be the best place to start with Animal Collective. I think Peacebone is a great introduction to the band. That's the opening track on the album. It's probably one of my favorite Animal Collective songs. If you really want to hear something weird and you really just want to start off with their strangest albums, then start off with their first albums. Pretty much up until last week, I was a huge fan of all this stuff. I avoided this stuff like the plague because I was scared. If you like being able to hear, maybe don't check this stuff out. Jokes aside, the albums are really good. I'm talking about Spirit They Vanish and Dance Manatee. Spirit They Vanish is a lot more like spacey and a lot more mystical, but I put them together because they both feature the same obnoxious, abrasive, high frequency, loud ass bullshit that can really put off a listener, but has a super high payoff if you get past all that loud frequency bullshit that might damage your hearing or make your dog run out of the room. Trust me, especially with Spirit They Vanish, if you let the songs develop, the payoff is worth it. Now, if you want to feel like you're on the verge of a panic attack, then go ahead and listen to Arc. This album has such a hectic nature to it that I don't think I've heard in any album ever. If you want the full experience of this album, listen to it in the middle of the night in a dark room. If you get scared, turn on the lights. I won't blame you. Now, if you're an Animal Collective fan, you've probably noticed that there's one album that I have not mentioned, and that is Feels. This is my favorite Animal Collective album of all time. And honestly, if you're a fan of more like indie rock stuff and you're looking to get into something more experimental, then this might be the best album to start with Animal Collective because it features a lot of conventional instrumentation in this album, I think. Still pretty experimental and might be a little bit weird at times. Trust me, it took me a while to get into the bees. The bees, the bees. There's definitely songs on this album that you'll love on the first listen, and there's songs that will take you a little bit to get into. But this album honestly feels like tasting candy for the first time. All of Animal Collective's albums have that kind of childlike wonderment feeling to them, but this album in particular is just super mystical and just super childlike and just feels so fun. It honestly feels like you and your childhood friend just came across this forest and you guys are exploring this forest for the first time. Hands down, the best Animal Collective album. If you have not listened to Animal Collective, I highly recommend you do. Let me know what your first Animal Collective experience was. How did you feel about the band when you first listened to them? I oftentimes hear people comparing Mid-Air Thief to Animal Collective. I don't really hear it, but if you want to hear a band that's just equally as unique as Animal Collective, check out this video and you'll learn all about Mid-Air Thief.